And good afternoon, and thank you for being here.
Watch your sneaker.
Yeah, I see that, thanks.
Okay.
Anyway, good afternoon. I got a trick question for you. Let's see if you can answer it.
What year is the war making?
Well, that would be Groucho Marx. You know, what's the color of George Washington's white horse? Or who's buried in Grant's tomb? Actually, it's not a question of legitimacy because
Nobody's buried.
nobody's buried in Grant's
Yes,
tomb. He's up there. He's in the mausoleum. Anyway, so who won the War of 1812? Americans or Canadians?
One would think the British. British.
Yeah.
British, because there was no Canada, but nobody won. It was kind of a waste of a war. But anyway, it was fought. And maybe there it is. It's a trick question. The roots of this war start in Quebec City in 1759. And the American Revolution arguably began on the Plains of Abraham, also in 1759. The White House would go up in flames during the War of 1812. America was 36 years old, and people around America and the Senate said, hey, you know what? Why are we so small? Why do we have like 15, 18 states? Why can't we be bigger? And the plan was to go west, to go south, and to go north, and take the rest of North America away from the Brits. The Brits had North America from Labrador over to British Columbia and north. And the Russians at that point also had Alaska. In June 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain in reaction to three issues. The British economic blockade of France, because if you go back to the American Revolution, it really was the French who came in to help the Americans, but it was an extension of all those European wars between the French and the English, and the French wanted a pound of retribution for surrendering in 1763. So there was that. The impressment of thousands of neutral American seamen into the British Royal Navy against their will. Basically, the Brits.
That's what I remember.
Yeah, the Brits kidnapped Americans and said, you're going to now fight against America. And then the British support of hostile Indian tribes along the Great Lakes frontier. Great Lakes is important because the fox trade was taking place there. There was money to be made in the Great Lakes. A faction of the U.S. Congress, made up mostly of Southern congressmen, and the South went just to Louisiana, or the West was along the Mississippi River, said, you know what, we need to finish the job. We did a good job in 1783, we got the treaty, we got the country, all that, we need to finish the job. The United States declared war on Britain because of the interference with American merchant ships, which forced the enlistment into the Royal Navy. And one of the place's earliest battles was up here, Mackinac Island, that is in Michigan. In the months that followed the U.S. declaration of war, American forces launched a three-point invasion of what we now know as Canada. But back in those days, they were the northern colonies. Yeah, it was Ontario, it was Quebec, it was Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. And they were repulsed. Except they started burning down government buildings as they went up or came back, which would lead to the ultimate burn down of buildings. At sea, the United States was doing a good job. The Brits were the best Navy in the world, but they were doing a good job. USS Constitution and other American frigates won a series of battles against the British warships. 1813, American forces won key victories in the Great Lakes region. But there was a problem. Britain regained control of the sea and blockaded the East Coast. Now, this guy, do you know anything about this guy?
No.
This guy should be a villain in American history. This guy's name is Major General Robert Ross. And he had one place in his sights that he wanted to take care of, the White House. The White House. In 1814, Washington, D.C. fell to the British in August. In Washington, British troops burnt the White House. the Capitol, and other buildings in retaliation for earlier burning government buildings in, well, now it's Canada, but it was Ontario, by U.S. soldiers. And he's going north and north and north. And if you go 40 miles north of Baltimore, or rather Washington, you hit Baltimore. And this place, Fort William McKendree. And this place is where Francis Scott Key was hanging out one day. However, the British would retreat. Fort William McKendree in Baltimore withstood a massive British bombardment and inspired Francis Scott Key to pen the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, you don't know this, but when Yogi Berra was alive, I used to speak at his museum over in Montclair State College or University in New Jersey. And I'd see Yogi all the time there. I'd speak there 3 times a year. And he'd always pat me on the back and say, "Good job, kid, let's go eat." But came up with a saying, "Ain't over until it's over," right? Ain't over until it's over. Well, on September 11th, 1814, the tide of war turned when an American naval force under Thomas MacDonough won a decisive victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh in New York on Lake Champlain. And it would be over for the Brits. They retreated north of the St. Lawrence River back into Quebec, and they abandoned their invasion of the U.S. Northeast, ended up in what is now Canada and Quebec. And so the negotiations began. This guy, Albert Gallatin, who has a statue in Washington, D.C., was the guy who was going to come up with the American plan for whatever was going ahead and accept whatever the British were going to throw at him. On December 24th, 1814, they decided it's back to the 1812 borders. Britain gives up American land near the border and the Great Lakes. The U.S. gives up Ontario and returns land to Spain, which they would get back in about 5 years. The President of the United States, James Monroe, signs the agreement.
James Madison, right?
James Madison, I'm sorry. James Madison, February 17, 1815. But nobody told this guy.
Yeah, and that's where the war came.
Nobody told this guy. And there is one guy who's happy that nobody told Andrew Jackson the war is over. Remember Johnny Horton, the singer?
Yeah.
1814, we took a little trip.
Down in Mississippi, then money.
Right! He made money off of this.
Right.
Singing, and so he's probably the happiest guy that Old Hickory was never told. It's over, but it ain't over until it's over. Old Hickory said we could take him by surprise. News of the treaty took almost 2 months to cross the Atlantic. And British forces were not informed of the end of hostilities in time to end their drive against the mouth of the Mississippi, which sets up the Battle of New Orleans, which was a needless battle. Like this war was a waste of war, because nothing was accomplished. On January 8, 1815, a large British army attacked New Orleans and was decimated by an inferior American force under the General Andrew Jackson in the most spectacular victory of the war, and he got a million-selling record out of it, the Battle of New Orleans, Johnny Horton. But if you go to Canada, okay, you go to Canada, and they are well aware of the War of 1812, ask them the question, because in 2008, I was on a bus tour of Ottawa that was arranged for a group of journalists. And we're seeing the buildings all through Canada, and the U.S. Embassy and the Russian Embassy, which is all gray, by the way. It's all gray, the Russian Embassy. And my son asked the tour guide this question: who won the War of 1812? What do you think she said? The tour guide. Who won the War of 1812?
The United
The
States.
French.
She said, we did. And then I said, who's we? Well, Canadians. I said, yeah, but you didn't have a country until 1867.
Right.
But why did you win? Because the Americans never invaded after that. It was the last time the Americans ever invaded Canada. And now you have a joint Canadian and American military doing exercises off of Halifax in Nova Scotia. But anyway, there's Jackson Square in New Orleans. Nova Scotia, done fighting. Nova Scotia says, hey, you know what? We can't beat the Americans. We almost joined the Americans. Can't beat them. But you know what? They had the right idea down there. We got to break away. Nova Scotia becomes the first colony in British North America and in the British Empire to achieve responsible government without a war in February of 1848, and became the first self-governing body through the efforts of a guy named Joseph Howe. Nova Scotia had established representative government in 1758. Now, okay, again, who won the war? Now, if you walk through Halifax, go through Halifax, and they have historic places in Halifax, and this is one of them. And basically it says, why aren't we Americans? Because Nova Scotia could have been the 14th colony. It came that close to being the 14th colony. We are not Americans.
14th what?
Nova Scotia almost became the 14th colony. We could have had not 13 colonies, 14 colonies. So why aren't we Americans? We're not Americans because of the service of men like sailors and soldiers, the casualties of the War of 1812, buried in this historic burial ground, which is near the epicenter of the business center of Halifax. They fought and died at sea and ashore to prevent the United States invasion and annexation of our country. Washington didn't think Nova Scotia was worth the expense of bullets to get it during the American Revolution when it was there for him to take. The War of 1812. There were no winners. There were no losers. The War of 1812, and I'll read this to you from this little exhibit, was a 32-month-long military conflict between the United States and Great Britain with its North American colonies and its native allies. On June 18, 1812, President James Madison declared war on Britain over issues, and I went through the issues: maritime free trade, the biggest one of all. And so who won the war? Well, if you go through this, and this is in Nova Scotia, you go through this, it says nobody won the war. Nobody lost the war. Americans didn't win. British didn't win. There was no Canada. The natives, they didn't win because they continued their suffering, the First Nations. The cost of peace, there were men that died, and then the Treaty of Ghent was eventually signed. But this was a wasted war. The U.S. and England become friends. And England had better things to do because they had to get back to Europe and go after people like Napoleon because he escaped Elba. And the French and English are back at each other's throats by February 26, 1815. And Andrew Jackson, he finds other things to do. Upper Canada was firmly established as part of the British Empire. They beat the Americans. Beat because the Americans never invaded again. The Americans were done fighting with the British Empire. So it's a win-win for both sides, right? Yeah, that's what it seems like that. You go to a place like, well, there's the Montana-Alberta border. It's got a fence. The fence basically is there to keep the cattle on this side of the fence. You know, you go to the border guards up there, and it's like this guy, hey, how you doing? Okay, yeah, 4 of you, go, we'll see you. And Sault Ste. Marie, yeah, it's, you know, you got the locks up there, and you got the shipping up there. Big shipping area for both the United States and Canada, mutual shipping. 1812 to 1815, the end. And it probably was the final act of actions that started 55 years earlier in Quebec and in Nova Scotia. And there's a great deal of history, some of which you actually were taught in American schools, if you read Evangeline. Anybody remember reading Wadsworth and Longfellow and Evangeline? Well, you got French Cajun culture in America, basically because of Longfellow. Evangeline, Tale of Acadia is a poem by the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, published in 1847. The poem follows an Acadian girl by the name of Evangeline in her search for her lost love, Gabriel, set during the time of the expulsion of the Acadians. You got to go back to, say, 1758, 1759, 1763 to understand the dynamics between what is now Canada and the United States, and the colonists, the northern colonists and the southern colonists. The expulsion of the Acadians from Nova Scotia was a forced removal by the British of Acadian people from Nova Scotia. New Brunswick did not exist at that point, and Prince Edward Island, and it was also known as Acadia.
There's a very nice park.
Yeah, Acadia National Park in
Acadia
Maine.
National Park.
In Maine.
Years ago, we visited up there.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
beautiful.
Yep, yeah.
And they have these guys that take you around,
Oh, yeah.
tell you all about it. And
Oh, yeah.
it's really
And there's
very
also,
nice.
the guys who designed that park also
It was a
designed,
different life then.
designed the Franklin Roosevelt park up in Westchester as well. It's built based on the same theory. That park started in about 1915, 1916. Now the expulsion, you're not taught about the expulsion in schools. You should be. 1755 to 1764, the French-Indian War. And by the way, who kicked off the French-Indian War? George Washington did, through a series of mishaps. In all, 14,100 Acadians in the region. Of that, 11,500 were deported. The French had this place called Louisbourg, and this picture here is the recreation of Louisbourg. It used to be 4 times the size it is today. And the British sacked Louisbourg and basically were able to start the expulsion. Montcalm, over in Quebec, dies on the Plains of Abraham. The English get Quebec City during the 7-Year War in 1759. The British, under the command of the general, James Wolfe, besieged Quebec City for 3 months. The city was defended by the French general, the Marquis de Montcalm. The very short battle of the Plains of Abraham lasted approximately 15 minutes and culminated in a British victory and the surrender of Quebec. The French, the problem with what the French did was, you'll see the picture in a minute, they didn't encircle Quebec City with a citadel. Had they done that, they might have kept Quebec City. And that is the Plains of Abraham. There's the Chateau, Frontenac, Chateau Frontenac back there, and you'll see the subsequent picture of what I'm talking about from up there. Those are, at that point, looking down is a cliff. And the French thought, there's no way the British are going to climb that cliff. There's just no way they're going to be able to get up the cliff. So they had the citadel and it just ends. And they say, well, you know what, they're not going to climb up the cliff. Just look at the drop there. It's over 200 feet. They're just not going to be able to do it. And if they do it, we're going to know they're coming. Except they did it in the dead of night and the French were kind of asleep. The British and French had coexisted in North America, but the threat of French expansion into the Ohio Valley during the French and Indian War caused the British to eradicate New France from the map completely. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham, Abraham owned the land. The city, Quebec City, is permanently lost by the French. In 1763, France formally ceded its claims to Canada, or the northern colonies. Quebec City's French-speaking Catholic population came under the rule of the Protestant British, and since 1759 or 1763, the English and French have not had an easy relationship in Canada. The American colonists are watching very closely in the South. Where was the South? Well, Nova Scotia is across the water from Maine now, but was across the water from Massachusetts in those days. And the southern colonists because they had relatives in Nova Scotia, knew that England had sacked the French and chased the French from Nova Scotia. So the English pulls its best troops. And they're thinking in New England and in Philadelphia and in Virginia, you know, the Brits have been pretty harsh to us, the 3% who mattered in the southern colonies. Most of the people living in the southern colonies, they were totally unaffected. Didn't matter whether it was British or American, didn't matter. For the rich people, it mattered to, because they didn't want to pay taxes. Taxation without representation. The Quebec Act, passed in 1774, was designed to help the Brits because they knew there was going to be a problem with the Americans. It allowed the Canadian, the Quebecois, to have religious and linguistic freedoms. And they could practice their Catholicism and speak French. The Canadians, or the Quebecois, were therefore not unhappy enough with British rule to choose to participate in the American Revolution. The Americans went after the Quebecois. They sent Benedict Arnold up into Quebec to see if he could seize the land. The American Revolution, which precedes the War of 1812, arose from growing tensions between the residents of Great Britain's 13 colonies, almost 14, and the colonial government, which represented the British Crown. Skirmishes between the British troops and the colonial militiamen in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, April 1775, kicked off an armed conflict. And by the following summer, the rebels were waging a full-scale war for their independence. Which leads me to ask you this question. Was George Washington a traitor? Yes or no?
Yes.
Trade to Britain, you mean?
He's a traitor to the Britain. Ben Franklin, traitor to the Britain. And all of that. So, what do you think would have happened to people like Washington or Benjamin Franklin if they didn't go into hiding on July 3rd, 1776, after they finished off the Declaration of Independence? What do you think would have happened to them if the British caught them? Hang them on the spot. Hang them on the spot. The founding fathers were traitors, for the most part. Not all of them, but most of them. France decides, hey, you know what? We're going to get involved in this thing. We're going to get involved in this thing in 1778. And this is a civil war between rich people. It's a civil war between George III and the upper crust of England and the upper crust of the colonies. But they decide to come in. And it's with the French help that the Americans would win the Revolutionary War. There's the Liberty Bell a long time ago. Over in Nova Scotia. So you didn't learn much about Nova Scotia, did you? About how they could have been the 14th colony. Well, they came this close. They came this close. Nova Scotia's in the dither. Whether the colonies should join the southern colonies in defiance of Britain, because they aren't too thrilled with what's going on with Britain either. But there was a rebellion that flared up at the Battle of Fort Cumberland in 1776 and the Siege of St. John, 1777. A lot of skullduggery that went around. A lot of people felt that there were double crosses going on. And that's Sydney and northern Nova Scotia. By the end of the war, Nova Scotia had outfitted a number of privateers to attack American shipping. They were friends before the war, but again, there was a lot of skullduggery and a lot of backstabbing and a lot of money that traded hands. Some for the good, some for the bad. In the end, the people of Nova Scotia said they couldn't trust the southern colonists. Some of them were their relatives. British military forces based in Halifax succeeded in preventing American support for rebels in Nova Scotia. While the British captured many American privateers in battles such as the naval battle off of Halifax in 1782, many more continued attacks on shipping and settlements in the final months of the war. The Americans, or the southern colonists, could not be trusted. Americans beat England in the Battle of Yorktown. The war is just about done. Well, it's goodbye. Actually, if you look at English history books, it was like, you know, they were one of the colonies that we lost over the years. No big deal. England goes back to fighting France. September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris is signed. American and British negotiators signed a treaty ceasing hostilities and recognizing American independence. The war formally ended in a Paris hotel room on the morning of September 3rd, 1783, when both sides signed a treaty pledging to forget past misunderstandings and differences. After all, they were the same people. They were the same money class. The treaty recognized the colonies as the United States of America, established boundaries, guaranteed that both nations would enjoy free passage on the Mississippi River. Except neither side was all that happy. Not happy at all. Meanwhile, George Washington says goodbye, says see you later. Washington says goodbye in 1783. Washington was one of those guys who didn't stand the British. Didn't like the fact he's paying more taxes. Didn't like the fact that he could not go west of the Appalachians. And the things that bothered him, like going west of the Appalachians, would continue to be a burr on the side of the Americans. He says goodbye to Francis Tavern, which is the seat of the government. After all, they're all British, so why not drink? Today it's a bar and a museum. So let me ask you a question about that guy behind my head, Benedict Arnold. Is he a hero or is he a traitor?
Depends.
Depends.
What side you looking at?
Depends what side you're looking on. Now, how about all the loyalists who are living in the southern colonies? Where are they going? The Brits have a problem here, and they're trying to figure out, well, where do we put these people? So we got Nova Scotia. And the Americans didn't bother going after Nova Scotia during the Revolutionary War. Washington decided he'd rather have Quebec than Nova Scotia, even though Nova Scotia was going to be handed to him on a silver platter if he wanted it. So this is St. John's, New Brunswick. The English carve up Nova Scotia, cut it in half, Nova Scotia, and they form New Brunswick. And New Brunswick is where all the loyalists ended up. They headed to Nova Scotia. And they flee the American Revolution, and most of them just go across the river, just a little bit across the river into New Brunswick. Land is taken from Nova Scotia. St. John is where a lot of them landed, and it would become Canada's first incorporated city. Then there's the strange case of Vermont. That's Bennington, Vermont. Bennington, Vermont. And strange case of Vermont. See, Vermont was kind of an independent nation during the Revolution. It was a bunch of land that New Hampshire wanted, New York wanted, and it abutted Quebec. In 1777, Vermont decides we're not going to be the 14th colony, or the 15th if Nova Scotia went in. But they become an independent nation. The Continental Congress, though, they had a problem. They're not letting Vermont go. But they don't want it to become part of the United States. Why? New York wanted a piece of Vermont. And other colonies said, you know what? Give it to New York. There is Vermont. After 14 years, it took 14 years, New York agreed that Vermont could become part of the United States. But Vermont had to pay its way in. Had to give New York $30,000. It's a lot of money in 1791. But Vermont wanted to join the United States after being an independent country for all those years.
I think there were jokes about Vermont
Might be.
being the only one on the road for miles and miles and miles.
So Vermont paid the money. So there are 14 states. And then Kentucky joins in, Loretta Lynn's restaurant in Bowling Green, Kentucky. The 14th and 15th states, March 4th, 1791, Vermont becomes the 14th state. The state was in the north. Kentucky is considered the South in those days. It becomes the 15th state. It would become balanced. Vermont in the north, Kentucky in the south. There would be more states that would join in the United States. Tennessee, 1796, Ohio, 1803, Louisiana, 1812. So there are 18 states, and they're ready to go to war. War of 1812 is the last conflict. No winners, no losers. But the victors write history. That's why Canadians think they won the war. The United States gave up on northern expansion, at least on British soil. They still had eyes on going north. And Nova Scotia always did it. Almost went with the southern colonists. Over time, Nova Scotia did want to break away from England. Same grievances. Taxation without representation, all that other stuff. Joseph Howe would lead the way. So the capital of Canada is Ottawa. Well, why isn't it Kingston? Why is it Montreal? Why isn't it in Quebec City? American considerations. Quebec City, Seaway. Looking at the Quebec capital. Quebec City, too French. Too French, too Catholic. Not going to be a good capital. Oh, there is the walled city, and you can see where the wall ends, right next to where the start of the rocky landscape, right there, cliff. Can't go to Quebec City. Kingston. Kingston. Look at the name Kingston. What do you think the city is named after? The king. It's also right over the St. Lawrence Seaway. It's too close to the American border. But people say, can't do Kingston. It's named after the king. Can't do that. Montreal? Too French. Too French. The choice on New Year's Eve, 1857. Queen Victoria, as a symbolic and political gesture, was presented with the responsibility of selecting a location for the permanent capital of the province of Canada. Well, they said you could do it, but it wasn't really her decision. She's the figurehead. The Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, was assigned to that selection process, and he decides, let's go to Ottawa. Let's go to Ottawa. You know why they went to Ottawa? It's 40 miles from the American border to Ottawa. You go up Route 16 when you go across the border. Back in those days, all swampland, filled with malaria. And they figured if we put the capital in Ottawa, filled with malaria going there in the swampland, what troops are going to invade us from getting to Ottawa? Ottawa's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. It's northeast of Montreal, but back in those days, you have to go through the swamp. The Queen's choice turned out to be the small frontier town of Ottawa, which used to be called Bytown. Had a lot of prostitutes in Bytown at one time. And now the city is,
What was it called?
Bytown, B-Y-T-O-W-A. A lot of stiff upper lip people there. If you want to have fun, you go across the border to Gatineau, Quebec City. That's open. Ottawa rolls in its sidewalks about 5 o'clock. Ottawa was isolated in the backcountry, surrounded by a dense forest. It's no longer surrounded by a dense forest. It goes down to Cornwall now. It's far from the American border in those days. Now it's, you just go up 16, you're there in about 55 minutes. And it's situated on a cliff face, making it more defensible from attack. Ottawa is halfway between Quebec City and Toronto. That was the Canadian, it was Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, that was it. So there is Parliament. Canada 150, that is Victoria, British Columbia. It becomes a country in 1867, and it is the biggest trade partner of the United States. I was in Vancouver for the 150th anniversary on July 1st, 2017. So why is Canada a country? It has a lot to do with America, an awful lot. In fact, it almost has everything to do with America. Yeah, the War of 1812 is long gone. But there were reasons for a nation. Political deadlock with England, demographic pressure, population's getting bigger, economic nationalism, promise of economic development, an inter-colony railroad which would improve trade, military movement, transportation in general. Those are some of the reasons. Cancellation of the Canadian-American Reciprocity Treaty, a free trade policy where products were allowed into the United States without taxes or tariffs starting in 1854, which was then considered beneficial to what is now Canada. 1865, the United States, partly as revenge against Great Britain for unofficial support in the South of the American Civil War. That was an extension to the Brits of the War of 1812. Let's get rid of that treaty. The possible threat of an invasion from the United States. The Brits, now the Canadians, had fended off American invasions during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. But the Americans buy Alaska. And this is a major, major problem. It's supported by the U.S. Senate, by Charles Sumner and others, Seward's Folly, precisely in terms of taking over the rest of North America from the Brits. And that was the goal, to take over, because British Columbia was out there, territory all the way up. Ontario, there for the taking, and some Americans wanted to do that. And the Canadians are looking, or the people of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and Quebec and Ontario, and they're looking and they're saying, hey, wait a minute, now we have to defend that? And that's a long border between Alaska and the British colony up there. Canada, though, starts in Prince Edward Island, and those are the red cliffs as you sail into Prince Edward Island. And it's 1864. And it's time to form a country, because we can't trust the Americans. Can't trust them. Yeah, we beat them in that war of 1812. Yeah, but we can't trust them because they're going to come after us. Time to form a country. 1864, 23 representatives from the Maritimes, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI meet in Charlottetown to discuss the formation of the country. This would be the beginning of discussions that would lead to the eventual formation of Canada on July 1st, 1867. John Hamilton Gray, meet John Hamilton Gray. There were two John Hamilton Grays as part of the delegation, and I'm trying to figure out which one is which there in Charlottetown. In September 1864, PEI hosts the Charlottetown Conference. First meeting leads to the process, or to the Quebec resolutions and the creation of Canada in 1867. Americans are on Canadians' mind. They meet in this place. Prince Edward Island, though, even though they're the host, says, we don't like the terms. We're going to stay a colony of the United Kingdom, or we're going to become part of the United States. Little island, St. Lawrence Seaway. And we're going to go talk to the United States because we have this inter-island railroad causing us a lot of debt. We'll join, we'll sell to the highest bidder if they take care of the debt of the railroad. Grant, President Ulysses S. Grant said, no, not interested. In the late 1860s, PEI, well, maybe we should become a country, but I don't know how much money you can make from raising potatoes. Yeah, well, let's see the United States. They're lukewarm. Well, throw in the towel. We'll join Canada in 1873. Canada forms 3 months after the Alaska Purchase. Russia sold Alaska to the U.S., so Great Britain wouldn't get it because it's right there on the border, and they were afraid the Brits were going to go after Russia. After all, they had fought in the Crimean War. Russia needed the money after the Crimean War, which lasted from 1853 to 56. See, I bet you didn't know how the Crimean War was connected to the United States. The northern colonies wanted their own country since 1839. And this building, which the last couple of times I was up there, was undergoing renovation. That's where Canada starts. Canada enters World War I, 1914, when the English got involved. Canada would enter World War II in 1939 when England got involved. 1931, Canada almost becomes a free country, ridded itself of the United Kingdom with the Statute of Westminster. And they get full sovereignty eventually in the Canada Act of 1982, and that removed the last remaining ties of legal dependency on the Parliament of the United Kingdom. Canada is a federal parliamentary democracy and a constitutional monarchy with Queen Elizabeth II, head of state. She doesn't do anything there. They have to just basically say, hey, Queen, you know what? We're doing this week. Okay, good. I have nothing to do with you anyway. The country is officially bilingual, and that's on the federal level. Queen is well-liked in Canada. And you go through Canada, and there are all kinds of statues like this. This is in St. John's, Newfoundland. And it's one of the statues in St. John's, because she visited St. John's, Newfoundland, back in the late 1940s. She's the ceremonial head of state. She appoints a representative to each province. The representative says, hey, Liz, let me say this, Saskatchewan's growing wheat this week. Oh, good, I'm glad to hear it. We'll see you later. And PEI, there's a statue of her in PEI. July 1st is the national holiday, but in Quebec, Jean-Baptiste Day seems to be a bigger holiday. It takes place on June 24th each year, which means it'll be next week, next Friday. And that's the day Quebecois celebrate. They don't really celebrate the national holiday, but then again, Quebec has tried to break away from Canada a number of times. It was the Iranian hostage situation. Canada was heavily involved in getting some hostages released back in 1980. January 29, 1980, U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and the Canadian government conducted a successful undercover operation to evacuate 6 of American hostages who had found refuge with Canadian diplomats in Tehran during the early months of the protracted hostage crisis, which lasted from November 1979 to January of January 79 to January 1981. We got it correct because that was up in Newburgh with Bob Lamulak. We drove together to West Point, got on the bus. We're going to see the hostages come back. We're going to do interviews with them, me for WRKL, me for WGRC, him for WRKL. We're on the bus, and this guy with a buzz cut haircut, something in his ear saying, you guys are not going to be talking, blah, 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 blah. So we got to wave to the hostages. Canada. Canada is also in space with the United States. It's a space bug, it's a space arm. The Canadian Space Agency is the National Space Agency of Canada. It's established in 1990 by the Canadian Space Agency Act. Canadian Space Agency is there to promote peaceful use and development of space, to advance the knowledge of space through science, and ensure that space science and technology provides social and economic benefits with Canadians, or for Canadians. It works closely with NASA. NORAD works closely, the United States and Canada. Oh yeah, there are disputes. I once, back about 35 years ago, was working with CBS Radio News as a freelancer. They sent me to the United Nations. And there's a dispute over fishing between the United States and Canada. And Clyde Wells, who was the premier of Newfoundland at the time, I'm interviewing him, and he says, all we want is our share of fish, it's our water. There are always arguments about lumber, how much lumber should come into the United States or go to Canada, how much fish should be taken out of the waters. Always these little arguments, but essentially the United States and Canadians get along rather well. And one of the freest borders you'll ever see in the world is when you go west of Lake Superior out to the Pacific coast. Vancouver is about a half hour away from the Washington border, and I went over the Montana-Alberta border. Canada, eh? Eh? Young people don't say eh anymore.
Yes.
They don't say eh anymore.
Duke Ellington wrote a song called Take the Train, eh?
Hey, hey.
A-train.
A-train.
Yeah.
Take the A-train.
Take the
Hey.
train, eh?
Young people don't say eh. That was something. And I asked people, I said, what is that, eh? I don't know. We just say eh, eh, eh. Canada 150, that is Sault Ste. Marie. Like I said, it is one of the largest ports for both Americans and Canadians. It's a great bridge that goes over there. It's a big, big bridge that goes over there. Little Current is where the first Vikings landed in New Brunswick, rather in Newfoundland back or in the 11th century. So in all, the United States' closest ally is Canada. They have a special relationship with Britain, but the closest ally, New York's biggest trading partner is Ontario. But you didn't know that. Do you know where New York gets a lot of its power from? Quebec. Quebec. They get a lot of power from Quebec. So, and then the story about British Columbia, which I didn't put in here. Do you know people who lived in British Columbia wanted to put up a wall in the 1870s? They wanted to put up a wall. The reason why? All those drunks from the Washington Territory were coming over the border and giving them a hard time. And it doesn't make sense when you look at the expansion of Canada. You got New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, you got Quebec, you got Ontario, and there's this large swath of land. And all of a sudden, there's British Columbia, who's in before Prince Edward Island was there. And the British Columbian residents at that time just said, gotta keep those drunk Americans out. They're causing all kind of havoc. So Canada is going to be 155 years old on July 1st. I will be here on July 1st, talking about Canada at 155, going into much greater detail about Canada. So who won the War of 1812? As we wrap this thing up. Who won it? Did the Canadians win?
Only for Canadians.
Except there was no Canada. There was no Canada. It's a trick question. If you want to make a bet with somebody who knows anything about history, just ask him. Who won the War of 1812? Oh,
The British.
the British. But the British didn't win. The British didn't win, they just retreated.
Depends.
And the Americans didn't win, they retreated. I guess you could say the British kind of won because they burnt down the White House.
That's right.
They did burn down the White House, and Dolly Madison and James Madison are running out trying to protect the George Washington picture. That's what Dolly Madison
Well, they
tried to do.
stopped the British from capturing.
But the British get up to Fort McHenry
And they stopped.
and never
Made them
go north. War of 1812 did give us the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, but it didn't give us the national anthem immediately. Do you know when the national anthem became the national anthem? 1931.
British drinking song.
1931. So it took, what, 117 years for the national anthem to become the national anthem? The song was played at places. In fact, the song was played at military establishments in the 1890s. It's also played at the Polo Grounds and in Philadelphia. The national anthem, which was the Star Spangled Banner, they had become popular during the 1917, 1918 World Series. I think it was the 1918 World Series. America's at war. It had to be 1918. It's 1917. We weren't at war during the World Series. And there were Army people at Fenway Park. It's the 7th inning stretch, and strike up the band, and they play the song. Basically it. The odd thing about that is that Red Sox playing the Chicago Cubs. And the Chicago Cubs, the last baseball team to regularly play the Star Spangled Banner. So I guess something came out of the War of 1812, the Star Spangled Banner. Other than that, Johnny Horton had a hit song. It's a forgotten war. People talk about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, maybe even the Spanish American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, and the Gulf Wars. But this war was
Wasn't
forgotten.
that the war where they made, like old Ironside, they made a different kind of...
That was Civil War.
Oh,
That was Civil War.
Old Hickory got his name.
What?
Old Hickory got his name.
Yeah. Old Hickory. 1814, we took a little trip down the mighty Mississippi. How many of you had that record? You had Johnny Horton. Biggest hit for Johnny Horton. So anyway, so thank you, and we will see you on Canada Day. I'll come in dressed in red and white,
Okay.
just for Canada Day. So, and I'll take you for a tour of Canada from the Yukon to BC to Alberta to Ontario to Quebec to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland. Do you know that Canada tried to buy a Caribbean island? So, well, I forgot which one it was. They tried to buy a Caribbean island because they were going to try to get their people not to go to Florida for the winter. They didn't want their people to go to Florida. They figured, well, let's go buy an island. And you know, and we'll have package deals and all that, but they couldn't buy an island. So, you know, French Canadians are still in Hollywood, and the
Big time.
yeah, Hollywood and Palm Beach, West Palm Beach, when Jack Kent Cooke got the Los Angeles Kings in the National Hockey League, and he thought, well, maybe they'll do well because there were 500,000 Canadians in LA. His joke was, I found all the Canadians who didn't like hockey. And then, so anyway, we'll see you in 2 weeks, and then we will talk about we'll be here on July 1st and July 22nd. And I'm not sure what we're talking about on the 22nd. Any questions or comments?
Well, yes, I've got a comment.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because when I was a graduate student in London,
Yeah. London, Ontario, or London, England?
London, England, not London, England, yes indeed, and so there were people from all over the planet, students from all sorts of places, and there was a group that were called United Empire Loyalists,
Okay.
and which means no Yankees, thank you very much.
Well, you know, when George III was told that America was lost, he couldn't believe it. But, you know, he didn't try to get it back immediately.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just a very interesting relationship that happened between, and it was basically a civil war among rich people. That was all that was. My favorite is Ben Franklin. You know, he wants to break away from England, and his son Richard is the governor of New Jersey, appointed by the king. Imagine Ben around the old dinner table with his son, arguing things. So, anyway, so thank you. So we got our biggest crowd here. Thank you. We'll see you in 2 weeks.